Welcome back to our podcast. Today, we have Ufeli Ani, who's got a really interesting set of perspectives from the startup world. And the startup world, one of the issues around startups is, of course, the funding side. And Ufeli has a perspective on both having a life cycle approach, plus looks at financing or funding from the startup side as a systems approach. And there are very different ways of getting money from a no strings attachment. And she's here to speak to us today. Ufeli, when I look at the startup world, myself, I'm an angel investor and I'm also an entrepreneur. And obtaining money, I often think of money as the fuel of the startup. And we can look at funding in two different perspectives. One, in the terms that it helps us skip forward in time. If we have some money, we can do things now faster than if we didn't have the money. And based on your experience, when you're looking at money or funding, we shouldn't really think in terms of funding or money as the only way to get that fuel for a startup, because we can do other things such as not spending money. In other words, getting resources, borrowed resources. And the first question I'd like to ask you is, if we look at funding of the startup, both money and not spending or borrowing resources, what is the systems view that you have? What are the various areas in which a startup person should be looking at for their funding?
Thanks, James. And I would say thank you as well for having me on. It's a pleasure to speak on this topic. I would say one of my first recommendations is to start with your own money. And the reason why I say that is numerous, but the first thing is that it takes away almost the fear of failure to a certain extent, because when you have an outside investment, you do have to report back on how it went, how you spent the money, the returns you've had, and that level of accountability makes you careful, which is great, but can also hinder your instinct development. And I think in some ways, at the very beginning of a business, you're going on an instinct anyway. You have an idea that you think this is going to be successful, and you may not have a benchmark for that or a pattern for it. You just feel like, based on this factor and this factor, if I combine these, I have a viable business. But you don't yet have many statistics to back that up. And I think if you start with your own money first, and I know, you touched on a point that you might not have that money to start, and there begins the kind of catch-22. But I do believe that with a vision comes the resources. So even if you have to work a limited end job to fund it, and you earn, let's say, $500 a month, and you just started bit by bit channeling that money into building your dream, or accessing tools, or accessing resources, and just education, to just start brick by brick laying the foundation of your business. When you do come to secure much higher checks, you do have something to already show as the beginning. And I think one thing that I've learned from trying to secure funding myself is people want to see that you've put your neck in the game a little bit. You've put your skin on the line. You've risked your own capital before they're going to risk theirs. And again, you touched on a brilliant point about not spending as much. At the beginning stages, there are sacrifices to be made. You're taking a almost non-conventional route by wanting to start a business anyway. And so you can't behave like everybody else is behaving. If people have extra money to buy clothes, to go out on the weekend, to go on vacation like once or twice a year, that's not a luxury that as a startup business owner you have. And so there's that element of sacrifice that you can put in to your dream.
There's two themes that I want to pick up on what you were saying there. You talked about an evidence-based approach. You said earlier in the startup, we may not have evidence. So today, one of the popular themes in the startup world is that a business plan is really full of assumptions. And the that startup phase is changing assumptions into fact over time. So we use funding in that broad sense of the word to change our assumptions into facts, provide evidence. The connotation of that, of course, is that implies that startups are along a life cycle And it also implies that as we get more evidence, as we change more assumptions into facts, that we differ on the risk associated with where we are in the stages. So for example, in the first stage, we may be proving technical viability of the idea. The second stage, we may be proving market viability. And each one of those stages has different risks associated with it. So the question that I then have is, one is, how do you look at funding as a system and divide it or segment it along risk? And two is, how do we look at funding and migrate from one risk segment or one risk type of investor to the other? What kind of evidence do we need to supply, and how does this whole concept of risk and funding and the sources of funding all work together?
Sure, I think it's a great question, because risk, how you assess risk, even as a regular human going about your day to day, you kind of measure it against the reward, right? So going out in your car is quite a risky activity when you look at the statistics of the amount of car crashes per day, or even the reliability of your model of car versus all of them made and the ones that have been recalled. And just the point is, basic day-to-day activities all have a level of risk, and the reason why we go for some is because we've measured that the level of reward here is better than others. And I would say one thing that is crucial to do as a business owner is to even assess what steps are necessary here, what steps can I handle by myself, and what steps will I need outside help to do. Because one thing you don't want to do is waste a resource. And that's quite risky, right? So let's say you have somebody who has the capacity to fund you $10 million, £10 million, wherever you are in the world, your local currency, but a significant chunk. You don't want to ask them for $1,000 ask, if that makes sense. You would rather find somebody who only has the capacity to give you $2,000 to meet that need, because your what's the word I'm trying to I hope I'm making sense, because basically the risk ratio of that person, you want to match it to the ask you're presenting, right?
Right, absolutely.
Secondly, there are stuff that's within your capacity that feeds to that evidence-based approach that don't cost any money. So when I was first assessing the viability of my business idea, I went to the streets and I spoke to people who I felt, fit into the target market, and I literally just had conversations. And those conversations are things that I can document and say, hey, in a given week I've spoken to 100 people who fit my criteria based on XYZ factor, and these are the responses that they've given me. If I had a bigger budget, I may have outsourced that activity and paid hundreds of pounds or dollars for that same information. But I've assessed that actually this is something I can do myself. It will take fine a week of my time, but it's going to bring a reward that I can say, hey, Mr. Investor, this is real life stories. These are real life people who have at least given me some time and have given me a positive response. So I think only when you talk about life cycle and kind of measuring what you should do first, there is a way to make stuff free. There is a way to take away the cost or minimize the cost of things that bigger corporations would spend so much money on because they can, but as a startup entrepreneur, you just can't. And I would say that's one thing, paper and pen, and just working out what can you do yourself and what do you need the bigger ticket investors to do for you, and how can you demonstrate and bridge the gap between what you have and what you need in a way that shows you're serious and you're as committed, even if just not financially committed. And there was another question you had about risk profile. Sorry, I didn't manage to write that down.
Well, the question around risk profile is, if we look at the various sources of funding, and it could be not spending money or getting other people's money, if we look at each one of these as different attributes of risk. So for example, a venture capitalist versus an angel investor, they have different risk assumptions. And what we want to do is move our startup along this life cycle. And as we do, risk should reduce. as we go from one stage, let's say product viability to market viability, we should see the risk profile reduce and therefore attract a different investor segment that has a different risk profile. So
Yeah.
I'm thinking in terms of this evidence-based approach that you just mentioned. And what comes to mind is that this is really an inverse of the traditional way that we might see in large organizations. In large organizations, we do primary and secondary research of the market and come up with an assessment, and then we do the product, and then we do the market launch. But this evidence-based approach is really saying we build a minimal viable product and then do a soft launch where we're talking to real customers. But the implication here is that as you're talking to real customers, that product concept is going to evolve and change. And that introduces a new risk in the startup, because we may have an idea of what it is we're trying to build. We talk to customers, it evolves. And this means that we're always kind of shifting on risk. We're gathering evidence, we're proving our assumptions, changing them into facts. But how do we deal with this evolving nature of the product in this evidence-based approach?
Yeah, I think it requires a level of confidence in what you're trying to bring to the table, because there's a danger if you ask too many people. They'll give you an impression of what they want, which is great because you want to serve the customer. But if you're trying to bring a visionary product or service to the market, it may be something that they don't yet know they need. And you also have to be confident enough to educate them back. So, right, if you get pushed back on a design element or a service feature, be able to challenge. And that's why I think the face-to-face discussion with what you deem to be your potential customer is like a great way to minimize that risk from the outset. Is setting up focus groups, and they don't have to cost you any money because these are people who are interested in having this product come to life. And yes, you do open up to several elements, version 1, version 2, because you're constantly going back to the drawing board based on this feedback. But if you're able to say, well, I think, dear customer, you may be wrong on this point because, or what if I did it like this, and what if I did it like this, and you've thought it through to the point that you can have a back and forth kind of discussion with a wide range of customers. That's helpful because, going back to the point about not wanting to waste a potential investor, these are questions that any savvy investor would potentially ask, right? Because good investors are able to get into the mind of the customer and be able to say, well, actually, this already exists, or the customer is serviced in this way. And by having those discussions, you're even reducing your risk of losing out on a major investment because you haven't thought of one angle. And I think that's one way that you're inverting the process a little bit, by just inviting your customers to be your first critics instead of building this product, going through the investor process to then present it to the customer at the end and realizing that the appetite isn't as strong as you first imagined. I think that's a really great way to refine early on. And even if you find that you were completely wrong, that's so much better at the beginning stages than going, 5 years worth of building in secret and realizing that you were wrong.
One of the things that you mentioned there was this idea that maybe the customer doesn't have an appreciation for the vision that you have. And we can think of Steve Jobs 15 years ago going to people and saying, hey, how would you like to text on your phone? And many people probably wouldn't have had the same vision. But that introduces an interesting risk area around the funding as well, in that we could have a visionary product, as you mentioned, and we could demonstrate it to people and they just don't get it. They don't see the implication of it. So this means that as an entrepreneur, we have to have the confidence in our vision that it holds, and yet at the same time collect evidence that our vision will hold, which sounds like it's going to be quite a tricky endeavor to convince people that this vision, which they do not appreciate or do not understand, is worthwhile, and to use that for investors and convince them that it's worthwhile. It sounds like quite a tricky endeavor to do that.
Yeah, sometimes you have to wait for a season, because I think there's a time when your products will not be appreciated if it's so revolutionary that it hasn't yet entered the mind of the general population. You will go through a season of being just completely cast aside because no one understands what you're trying to do, and that's where self-funding comes in, because there's a time there will likely be a time when it's only you who can see the use and the relevance of this product, and you can't get an investor on board because they just don't understand. You can't get like crowdfunding, for example, because the population don't just understand, and so you then have to say, well, I can see what the customer will need in 5 months from now that they don't yet appreciate, and therefore I'm going to put 5 months of secret work, private funding into this product, and in 5 months when they've caught up, I'm already there because I've been working underground. And I think that is where people like Steve Jobs, Elon Musk of our generation are going to have made money and will continue to make money because they're seeing ahead. I mean, the late Steve Jobs phone is not as relevant now, but the platforms they've created are ahead of the general customer, but right there when the general customer has been educated enough, if that makes sense. It's being ahead of the curve, being willing to invest ahead of the curve, and then capitalizing on the gain when you've been able to educate your target market enough. And there's a risk in that, because if 99 people are seeing things one way and you're seeing it the other, you may well be wrong. But if you're right, then you have 99 people who are going to buy that product if you're able to educate them well enough.
Okay, very cool. So let's go to our wrap up and some takeaways here. And there's some interesting threads that came out of what you're saying. And I'm wondering if you can speak to some ideas that our listeners could implement, maybe on the practical side, perhaps as an entrepreneur or an investor, or on the academic side as an individual teaching entrepreneurship or researching it. Do you have some practical, implementable takeaways for our listeners?
Sure. I would say one thing is to start small, because as we touched on in the podcast, things can change. You could have one conversation that completely throws off your original hypothesis, and you have to tinker with your idea. So the smaller you start, the more agile and adaptable that prototype will be. I would say start local. So start with your own savings to the extent you can, then branch out to your family members who hopefully will be forgiving if it doesn't work out as fast or as well as you thought it would, and then move into maybe like your local region through grants, competitions, and just start local and evolve naturally with your funding, but potentially bring a major investor on board in a conversational manner. And just to let them know that, hey, this is what I'm working on. I'm funding it myself at the moment. The next level of funding, I'm going to do it this way. But I just wanted to put it on your radar so that I'm working on this, and I'm putting my own skin in the game first. Second way I would say is cut back. If you're planning a wedding, for example, perhaps try and do it on half the budget you originally would have and put the extra. If you were trying to buy a car, get a later model than you would have and put the extra in. There definitely have to be sacrifices that you make if you want to self-fund, and I would say that. So that's for the practical entrepreneur. And then I would say for the academic, there's the concept that we just spoke about, where there's an educational level to entrepreneurship a lot of the time with innovative business and services. So sometimes you have to allow for off the wall, and in a way I would welcome comments from academics, the people who do teach entrepreneurship, because it's hard to teach something that is constantly evolving. The principles remain the same, but then how do you educate your customer base? How do you stay ahead of the curve as an entrepreneur, and how do you get the knowledge you need when your prototype hasn't been done before?
Thank you. So today we were talking to Ufeli Ani, and she was talking about entrepreneurship and risk and the different kinds of funding approaches. Thank you, Ufeli.
Welcome. Thank you for having me.
That's it for today, and don't forget to stay tuned for future podcasts.